Welcome to Lean Into Excellence, a Workstream Consulting podcast. I'm Liz Crescenti.
And I'm Marco Bonilla.
And we will be your hosts as we embark on our continuous improvement journey. Welcome back to another episode of Lean Into Excellence. I'm Liz Crescenti.
And I'm Marco Bonilla.
And today we have one of our fan favorites back on the podcast. We have Mr. Doug Bruce. Welcome, Doug.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks, everybody.
I will say, Doug, your episode we did on process mapping, we referenced that episode, I don't know, pretty much every episode.
It's the basis of everything. It's everything. If you don't have a process map, you are lost in the forest.
So we are always dropping your name every episode.
Nobody ever said they name dropped Doug Bruce, but...
No, we name drop process maps. Is what we do. Doug.
There you go. There you go.
That's my go-to every single time.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the top 3 tools. We'll use it any engagement you ever go to, right? If you call us up and you say, "I need help," the first thing we're going to do is let's lay out the process. We need to understand what's going on here. So, but we're not here to talk about process maps, are we?
Not today. Although we could. We could keep it going. I know we have people wanting more from that episode, but today, Marco, what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about Kaizen events and what is a Kaizen and why it's beneficial.
Yeah. Well, there's a process map to a Kaizen, isn't there?
There's absolutely a process map to a Kaizen.
Let's really get deep into the matrix there.
Yeah. All roads lead to process maps.
Yes. You could make a drinking game out of process mapping. How many times we talk about it. But we won't today because it is Monday morning.
Right. That's true.
So let's just kick things off. And Kaizen event, what is it? Why is it important? And what's the primary purpose that one would use this for?
Well, I like to say a Kaizen is a rapid, time-bound, results-orientated, measurable event, right? You get in, you get something done, and you get back out. I contrast a Kaizen event with other continuous improvement things, projects, greenbelt projects, or things like that seem more like a quest, whereas a Kaizen is get in, get it done, and get back out. So consequently, you need to scope the work to be done appropriately. You know, we hear the term all the time, boil the ocean. We don't want to boil the ocean in a Kaizen event because we have to stay focused on the thing that we're going to try and do. So I like to coach people to think of something that they need changed that they've had trouble getting changed in the past, right? What is that sticky wicket? What's that thing that you've been trying to fix, but you just can't quite wrap your arms around it? A Kaizen event might be the way to approach that.
Mm-hmm.
Doug, interesting enough, right? So you kind of mentioned scope, and we've been on a lot of Kaizen events, right? One of the most important parts is really understanding what you're going after. How do you define what the problem is, right? And not going after some of the symptoms per se.
Well, it's the classic conundrum of business management is, what do I need to improve? We look across the landscape of our business and we say, there's so many things here. And what is it that if I turn this one dial, if I fix this one thing, then that's going to improve my profitability. That's going to improve my on-time delivery. That's going to improve my customer retention. And trying to find what that magic dial is going to be a struggle for everybody. The Kaizen assumes that you've already selected that. So we could do a whole nother webcast on how to pick projects and things like that. But once you've down selected and decided to use the Kaizen methodology to get after something, then you're like, I picture it like a funnel, right? So we have this big wide funnel at the top with all sorts of projects and ideas and things like that. And we're funneling down. And once we get to the Kaizen phase, we've said, okay, we're going to get after this one thing, or we're going to try and improve this one process. And we're not going to iterate on this over and over again over the next 6 months. No, we're going to get in, we're going to get it done, and we're going to put a stake in the ground, make a change, and then stand back and say, how did that work? Right. So in that sense, I think of Kaizens as an iterative process. You make a change, you reflect on how well the change went. You reflect on whether or not, what did you learn from making that change? Did you move forward? Did you move backwards? Right. There's this methodology, the Toyota Kata methodology, where you set a target condition or a future state and a target condition, and you strive towards that target condition. And I see Kaizens as being a valuable tool in the toolbox of achieving those future target conditions. So let's just say that you want to have you streamline your process. You're taking too long to deliver material to the customer. So you look through your process map, to reference back to our process maps, and say, all right, where's the tallest pole in the tent here? What's the longest lead time thing? What's the longest activity in my series of activities to deliver to the customer? And then you assemble a team, you assemble a Kaizen team to get after that. And you tap into the team's creativity and the team's knowledge to say, what can we change about this specific, narrowly focused area?
Hey, Doug, I know this is a kind of a big topic and you can go a lot of different ways, but let's talk about the challenges of a Kaizen, right? All people, place, project, leadership, right? What would you say are the biggest challenges, and how do you overcome those?
Right. Well, I think you touch on several different things there, and they're all challenges, and each Kaizen is unique in the challenges that it faces. But you're right, they all kind of fall into several different buckets. So the first bucket is knowing what you're going to get after and scoping it appropriately. The second bucket is, once you've identified what you're going to get after, you have to assemble the proper team. So team composition is very important. If you're going to work on something that's operations focused, you better have some operations folks on your team. And we always like to encourage you to have a supplier and a customer on the team as well. So if you're, say, right smack dab in the middle of your manufacturing process or your product delivery process, right? Who's the customer? Who's expecting the output from this particular task? They should be on the team because they're going to direct you as to what a good quality output and something that's useful to them will be. You also need a supplier on your Kaizen team to say, how can they help improve things? I'll just jump into a quick little story here real quick. We were running a Kaizen one time on a chemical storage process, and we had a tank that was like 1,000-liter tank or something. And every time the supplier would come and deliver fresh batch of chemicals, we had to run our tank almost all the way down to bone dry because their truck would fill our tank all the way up to the top. And it was a constant problem for operations because they had to do special things to empty that tank, and that would cause production problems. Well, we got the supplier involved, and the supplier came back to us and they said, oh, well, we didn't realize that was a problem. We'll just send our smaller truck and give you half a batch each time instead of a full batch. And that totally eliminated some of the problems, some of the operational problems that we were experiencing inside. And this only came about through engagement and involvement of the customer, of the supplier in our Kaizen event.
Imagine that communication. Yeah. Communication is always at the root of all evil, right? A lack of communication.
Yeah.
Lack thereof. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you asked, what could go wrong with Kaizen events? So improperly scoped Kaizen is the first thing. Team composition is another thing that could go wrong. Let's see, some other things. Preparation is so important. Ensuring that when you get the team together, you want the team to be effective right from the get-go. So what can you do to prepare beforehand? The facilitator's role in this is so important because they're going to, say, walk the process or try and create a straw man process map. They're not going to try and identify everything about the process, but at least a place to start, because lot of teams face that blank page syndrome where they say, I'm not sure where to start or what we're working on. So when I'm facilitating, I like to have some prior knowledge and throw up that fishbone or that basic structure to say, here's where we're starting, here's where we're ending, here's what's in scope, here's what's out of scope. And teams can really wrap their heads around that. And you know right away if you've got the right people in the room. You said, somebody may raise their hand and say, well, if that's what your focus is, we really should have, we should have Marco from the warehouse department in here because they're a critical part of this process. And recognizing those gaps early on are really important to having a successful Kaizen.
And Doug, it's funny that you mention that because what you talk about is roles and responsibility. But there is in a 3-day Kaizen, for example, if it's a 3-day, you're really thinking about personalities too, right? Because even though they're the right person based on roles and responsibility, they might not be as what's the word I want to use? Open to the process, right?
Yep.
And that I assume that's another challenge. Yeah. They're just not as constructive as a team player in that case, right? So what do you do in that case, Doug?
Well, that's one of the most important roles of the facilitator is to ensure that people feel comfortable contributing to the Kaizen event. A lot of employees, in my experience, approach these types of events as here we go again, just another event that's not going to have any measurable outcome or where they're not going to listen to what we have to say or anything like that. So two things to discuss there. One is the leadership commitment to actually making the changes happen. And two, the facilitator's role in bringing those people along and encouraging the participants to share their knowledge and wisdom. Right. I like to use a brainstorming technique during Kaizens and get all the ideas out there. The obvious ideas, the crazy ideas, the high dollar capital ideas, the low dollar just go do it type of ideas. Get it all out there and map it. I like to use flip charts or post-it notes and put it up on the wall, and then use that as a selection technique to help teams kind of guide teams into the scope of the Kaizen, right? If we go into a Kaizen with leadership commitment and say, yeah, we know we have a problem. Let's say leadership's doing a Kaizen event to establish a new process where we need to identify some new production equipment or something like that. Well, you definitely need some engineering folks. You definitely want some operations folks to collaborate and work together. And in an environment like that, where there's like a mix of backgrounds and educational levels, it's important to balance the room and ensure that not one party or one function dominates the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Doug. And I'm glad you wrapped this around back to leadership, right? Because my next question was going to be how important, right? And in any of these continuous improvement projects or event, how important is a champion, a strong champion, right?
Well, absolutely. The champion is the person that's going to set the scope and the tone, maybe potentially do a kickoff. I like to make sure that the champion is the owner of the process, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're controlling the resources. You got to get, we haven't talked about setting up a Kaizen, but you need to get the commitment of the people's time. Another one of the things that causes Kaizens to struggle is that people aren't given the latitude to step away from their day job to focus 100%, right? If you're in a Kaizen event and everybody has their phones out or their computers open and they're worried about answering emails or trying to solve the latest production problem on the floor, you don't have their undivided attention, and it's going to be
half in, half out.
Yeah. So
it actually defeats the purpose, right, of a Kaizen event.
You're wasting your time. I mean, you're wasting everyone's time. You're not focused, and you know you can't do two things at once.
Sometimes leadership will come along and say, "Yeah, but they still need to make the trains run on time." So that's a negotiation that needs to happen before the Kaizen event even starts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one of the things I like to say is, then let me have somebody who can be effective and efficient in a Kaizen event. So let's switch them out, right? And we can have this other person that was originally thought of as one of our go-to specialists if we need to reach out to them. but we need people's undivided attention in this room, right?
Yeah, we need everybody 100% on board.
Now, Doug, you talked about employee engagement. How do organizations overcome resistance related to Kaizen events?
That's a great question, Liz. Resistance comes in several different forms. There's resistance from leadership to do this, to say, what are we going to get out of this? There's also resistance from employees participating into Kaizen events, right? I think overcoming resistance is all about effective communication and involving employees in the change process. Change is not something that's done to you. Change is something that we do together. So employees oftentimes will say, well, I've shared all my ideas before and nothing came of it. And my response to that is, going back to the goal of the Kaizen being a rapid, time-bound, results-oriented process, right? We're going to get in, we're going to make some changes, which really leads me to the next question, or the next thing that I wanted to touch on, is this idea of how do you know, right? What do you expect to see when a Kaizen is done, right? In my book, there's two different touch points, or two different touchstones to know when you're going to have a Kaizen that's going to be effective in delivering its results. A Kaizen is going to be effective when you physically change the workplace. Some Kaizens, oftentimes in manufacturing, we say we need to move some machines around. So if you physically change the workspace to allow the flow to be improved, that's going to be a change that's going to stick. The second the second thing that'll really make change stick is, say we're working in an office environment or a support environment, right? Have we changed the software flow? If we're using software to manage our business, have we changed that workflow? Oftentimes, say you're working in a procurement approval process, and you're sending something around for a number of different signatures, and you're probably managing that with several different Excel spreadsheets, right? Well, I sent this off to so-and-so for approval, right? If you make some sort of software change that manages that workflow differently, then you're going to have a Kaizen output that's going to stick and be sustainable. Right, the sustainment thing is such an important piece, because people say we make changes and we always just backslide. Well, you have to physically change something, or in the virtual world, you have to change your software workflow to make that change stick. Which also brings me to another point: is one of those red flags to say, is this Kaizen going to be successful or not? One of the red flags that I look for is if the team is trending towards, well, we need to develop a 30, 60, 90-day implementation plan. Maybe we've missed the boat a little bit. We've either scoped it too broad, or we haven't had the right people in the Kaizen event to make changes at the Kaizen event. Right? If you find yourself saying, I need a 30, 60, 90-day implementation plan, what can you do with the team in the event to say, okay, that's great, but what changes can we make today? What changes can we make this week that will drive a changed behavior next week? And where I see this manifest itself most frequently is around software changes, IT infrastructure, software changes. So let's say we are using Oracle and we need to get some new Oracle reports generated, or let's say we're doing we need to change our EMS management workflow or something like that, and we don't have the right people in the room, or we need to get some sort of approval, or maybe we're using a third-party tool and we need to get the third-party services involved to make that change, right? Well, I'd say first off, maybe we should have had somebody from that software manufacturer in the room in the first place, or at least a subject matter expert that's on our staff, say your Oracle system administrator or something like that, somebody on the team that can make those changes, at least in a sandbox type environment, so that you can test it out and see if your changes are going to be impactful or not.
So, Doug, over the past few years, there's definitely been a shift to a more virtual environment. And it doesn't always work, but sometimes it's not even for COVID, but people are just located in different locations and they can't all come together in person. So, do you have any
Yeah,
experience running these events virtually?
absolutely. That's a great question because you're right. We are increasingly in a remote work environment, and the short answer is yes. So I'll just touch on running a virtual Kaizen. My number one choice or my number one preference is to have everybody together in one
Yeah.
place. And I've run global Kaizens where people have flown in from around the world, which is, I'd say, best case scenario. But now with the quality of our virtual tools and virtual whiteboards and things like that, it's become practical to run virtual Kaizens. And I'll give just one example that I did in the medical regulatory world, where we had a team from around a large state in the southern part of the state and the northern part of the state, and bringing people together was impractical. So we used a virtual whiteboarding tool. In our case, we used Mural, but Miro is also another very popular whiteboarding tool. And we did everything on the virtual whiteboard. Even if you have people locally and people remote, you can do this. And actually, I think it's a best practice to do it this way if you have people dialing in remote. When you're 100% in person, you're using Post-its and you've got fish bones and whiteboards and flip charts, and you're papering the walls of the room with your work product. But when you have people online, obviously they can't be there and they can't participate in that physical realm. So using one of these virtual whiteboard tools is really the critical success factor to that. And my preferred tool is Mural, like I said. And in our
Not
case,
sponsored.
No, not sponsored. No,
Not sponsored.
Just have to throw that in there.
Yeah,
Not yet though. Not yet.
yeah. And it was very successful at creating the beginnings of the process, right? If you want to create a process map, people in different regions or different physical locations probably do what we call the same job, but they do it differently. So, say people in the Scranton office may do something one way, and people in the Hartford office may do something a different way. But they're basically, say selling paper and processing invoices. The job says the same at the top, but they're following two totally different workflows. So bringing these teams from different environments together in one virtual arena to hammer out those details can be very beneficial to the overall smooth operation of the company.
It's amazing how many aha moments you have when you have two different facilities that do the same thing, and I do that as air quotes.
Yeah.
But they've never realized they're following different methodologies or processes, right? Back to the process map. See how I wrap that back in there, Doug?
Yep, there we go. Drop it again.
No, that's a very good point, Marco. Whether we've worked with companies that have quality functions that do quality documentation processes across all their sites, say around the country, and they may have a dozen or more locations that are all following a ISO quality documentation process, but they're doing it in different ways. Now, think of yourself as an auditor going to these different facilities, and you're seeing the same names on the outside of the building, but they're completely different processes on the inside. And you say, how can this be?
Might as well be two different clients, right, Doug?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Learning and development. I've recently been at a company where I saw learning and development practiced differently at different sites, which is okay. But then when it comes to documenting whether employees are properly trained and certified to do the job that they do, right? What is the common corporate method for doing that? And a virtual Kaizen is a great way to bring those people together and do that in one virtual space. So I love to do that type of event. how long should this be? We really haven't talked about that, right?
Yeah.
Right.
What's
If you're
the
doing a virtual
ideal time?
Kaizen, yeah, people staring at a screen all day long, they zone out, things like that. So if I'm doing a virtual Kaizen, I like to do that in no more than say 4-hour blocks, right?
Mhm.
If we're in the room, yeah, we're doing this as a full day, 8-hour, maybe a 3 to 5 day type of thing. I like 3-day Kaizens unless you're in a factory or something like that, physically moving equipment around and cardboard cutouts and things like that. Then maybe you need the 4th and the 5th day. But if you're working on a back office process or something like that, I like a 3-day Kaizen for that. But if you're in the virtual world, you got to schedule this in shorter blocks. I like 4-hour blocks, and I like the morning block better than the afternoon block because people
Yeah.
are
You
more
don't want that
attentive in the morning.
post-lunch. Yeah, post-lunch fog.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And speaking of food, you need to make sure you have food for everyone
Oh,
involved. Those all-day
absolutely.
events.
Yeah.
That's the hook, Doug. That's the hook right there, right?
Yeah.
You'll
Come for the
feed them.
pizza.
Yeah.
Stay for the virtual fellowship.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that goes back to running a good Kaizen or facilitating a good Kaizen. We've got checklists that start 6 weeks out from the Kaizen. What is it you're getting after? Do you have key metrics? Is there a target metric that you're trying to improve through this event? Let's say you're trying to improve on-time delivery, or you're trying to improve inventory accuracy, or you're trying to reduce the time to process AP and AR invoices, right? What is that target metric that you're trying to improve upon? Knowing that up front, if you've got 2, 4, 6 weeks ahead of time to collect some baseline data, that's invaluable. And then you can assemble the team, right? And then when you assemble the team, what do you need to do as part of running that event, right? And ensuring that you have proper meeting room space. I've seen Kaizens, they try and shoehorn it into a little, 6x8 conference room.
No windows.
No windows.
No windows.
Yeah, no windows, no doors.
Solitary confinement.
Well, there's 6 chairs in there, and you only have 6 people in your Kaizen. Yeah, you need some elbow room in a Kaizen event.
Yeah, you're going to get up and move around.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to book an appropriate space to ensure that you're going to have a successful event. And then the materials that you need to have present. I've got a Kaizen kit that has a bunch of Post-its and sticky notes and 3x5 and 4x6 cards and in different colors, markers, like boxes of pens and pencils and things like that.
Butcher paper,
absolutely. These are the tools that we'll use while we're facilitating the event. And then afterwards, I like to have people working in the physical realm. I like them to write their ideas down on a Post-it note, and then we stick it up on the wall, and then maybe we'll affinitize all those ideas into short-term implementation or long-term implementation, or low dollar implementation, high dollar implementation, or things like that. Or I like the idea of physically writing it down and sticking it up on the wall, and then people can represent their ideas. Afterwards, after the Kaizen is over, we'll document this. We'll create an electronic version of the process map that we created during the Kaizen event. We'll create an electronic parking lot with all the ideas. We'll have an electronic copy of the fishbone that we had. We'll have our implementation plan, and all those will eventually be turned into digital collateral so that we document and have available for future reference what happened in the Kaizen event. But in the room, I like everybody to be present and writing things down using pen and paper with their own hand.
So Doug, actually, I want to follow up on one thing you said is, besides your preference being in person, because a lot of this, that you're talking about is in-person success, right? But besides being in person, the preference of being in the location where the process is going to be improved is something we haven't talked about, right? Because you can be all in person, but you might not be in the actual facility or the place of where this improvement is going to be.
Where you're trying to make that change.
So how important is that part of it too?
Oh, the Gemba. I'm so glad you brought up the Gemba. Being in a place or in a location where you can go and walk the process. That's so important. In the first day of a Kaizen event, I insist that the team walk the process, however that manifests itself. If you're not in the physical location where the work is done, it makes it really difficult to go walk the process. So to your point, a Kaizen event in the location where the work is done is absolutely top of the list, number one priority. If you can't do that, how can we, and maybe you're doing this Kaizen in a virtual world. I've seen instances where we have somebody on site, on location, take their iPhone and do a FaceTime and walk the process with their phone enabled. And they're streaming back to a conference room where everybody is in the conference room seeing what's going on. That way, the people in the conference room that aren't physically walking the process, they could still be engaged. They could still be asking questions. No, turn the phone over there to your right. What's going on over there? What's that big pile of inventory sitting over there? Right. So it's not ideal, but it's a good second option.
Right, and those situations should be minimized, right? I mean, again, preference is in person. Well, in person, the right location, right? The actual location that's actually improvement's going to happen in the right people, right? We've talked about this.
Yep. Right.
So excellent, good point.
Yeah. How do you walk the Gemba for a digital process, right? So what I like to do in those cases is have our subject matter expert walk us through the process as they understand it. Or here's another alternative that I love to do is get somebody that's relatively new to the process, that's been trained on how to do the process, and have them walk through the process the way they understand it. And oftentimes in that case, a subject matter expert will be like trying to jump in. Yeah, wait, no, don't do that, go over here. And I insist that the SME, the subject matter expert, sit on their hands, or better yet,
duct tape their mouth.
Duct tape the mouth. I was going to say,
paper and write down everything that they see that they would say, well, they should have done it this way, or they should have gone over to that screen. And then, right, because that's the grist for this improvement process. That's an actual case of somebody who's been trained walking through the process, but not with the same level of understanding and expertise as the seasoned professional or the subject matter expert. That's the disconnect that oftentimes makes Kaizen improvement efforts successful, is closing that gap, right? If we can identify gaps and close those gaps, and maybe there's a problem with the training, maybe there's a problem with confusing screenshots, maybe there's a problem. I was just recently taking a training, and the button that said "Continue to next lesson" was the background and the lettering were the same color, so you couldn't see. How many of us have come across user interfaces on a computer that are botched up? Happens all the time, right?
It does.
We learn, this grayed out button's the one I need to click, even though it's grayed out, right? We learn those things, but a new person to the process doesn't know that. So things can get stuck in limbo.
Yeah, and the reverse could be true, Doug. We've run into this a few times where the subject matter expert has created a process or a systematic approach to doing something without understanding all the facts, potentially, right? The people who do the work in the trenches, the mentoring that goes on to a new person, tribal knowledge, there might be a reason why they're doing their steps in a different order than the subject matter expert realizes until they witness it, right? There might be a potential reason for an improvement. So sometimes you're right, getting someone who's fresh to the team, someone who's just got mentored or educated on the process, watching them do it is really important. Because it might not be you're right, I'm wrong kind of thing, right? There might be something real behind this.
Yeah. And back to your Gemba walk comment, right? Walking the process at different times or with different people is invaluable. So if you're an electronic process or in a virtual environment, having different people show how they do the process, or if you're in a physical environment, maybe you're in a 3-shift operation, go walk the process on first shift, but then go walk the process on second shift or third shift, because you'll oftentimes find different things. Second and third shift don't necessarily have the same engineering support. I saw one time a warehouse where they had installed skylights to let daylight in, and they changed over their lighting in the warehouse to high energy efficiency lights. With the new skylights, there was plenty of light during the day, but at night it was half as bright inside the warehouse, and people were struggling to read pick tickets and inventory locations and things like that. The people that installed the process never considered those, it's dark 24 or 12 hours out of the day.
Yeah.
Doug, actually, that's a great segue, something I hadn't thought about. How often have you run a Kaizen that cross shifts? In other words, if you're doing it in person and doing it 8 hours, if you know there's more than one shift in this process, do you do a 4 hours at the end of the day from shift 1 into 4 hours beginning of the day of shift 2? Would that be helpful?
Yes, that's a great way to do it. Run your Kaizen event from, say, noon to 8 p.m.
Right.
Our natural inclination is to do something on first shift, but you're excluding those other participants. Sometimes I've seen
a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I've seen instances where they ask a second or third shift participant to come on to first shift. But you bring up a great point, Marco, that maybe we need to share this burden, and that's part of engaging the employees and giving those second and third shift employees a sense of their importance to this process too.
And you'll appreciate that there might be some challenges during second shift because there's less support, as you know, right? Usually there's less support on second and third shift that you wouldn't necessarily see during first shift because everybody's there, right?
Yeah. So I saw one time somebody was doing data analysis, and they said, well, our machines are down more frequently on second and third shift. And so we need to do something about that. Well, come to realize that there's just no maintenance or engineering support on second and third shift. So when a problem manifests itself or when something breaks, it just gets shut down until the first shift crew comes in to fix it. And then first shift suffers because they also saw, well, why are startups always slow on first shift? Well, because they're fixing the problems from second, third shift.
The carryover, right?
Yeah.
The carryover.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's costly.
Mm-hmm.
It's very costly, right? And it's ineffective, right? Because you're not hitting the ground running. You're kind of starting from scratch every day, right?
You're putting the fire out as you get in.
Exactly.
Right.
And you're coming into a fire.
Yeah, so I'm working a situation right now where there's a particular manufacturer with a 3-shift operation, and they have a low efficiency or low effectiveness on their primary machine across all 3 shifts. So, and guess what? They're having trouble staffing up second and third shift because people don't want to work the swing shift and the graveyard shift. So, right, could they improve the machine efficiency, improve the operational efficiency on first shift, and get the same amount of production capacity on one shift and not have to worry about those staffing problems on second and third shift? Hey, Marco, you mentioned earlier, the idea of making sure that the team is taken care of during the Kaizen event, feeding them, watering them, it's like having a good garden. You have to run a good room, as Andy Sipowicz used to say. What do you recommend? Do you have any ways of, once the Kaizen event is over and you've accomplished what you've set out to accomplish, how do you recognize the team? How do you appreciate the efforts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a must to recognize the team, right? There's a lot of effort, a lot of stress throughout a 3-day. There's a lot of work involved, as you know, right? And you're locked in a room for the most part for 3 to 4 or 5 days.
Not literally.
Not literally. Not that 6x6 cell as you mentioned before. But leadership has to appreciate, and obviously they're not there the whole time, so you need to let them know. You need to give them an update. So look, you know what? This team did really, really well. The success of the outcome of the Kaizen shouldn't be the factor to whether or not you should congratulate the team, right, for their effort, right? So there's probably lots of things you can do, but leadership has to recognize them. openly, right, Doug?
Yeah,
There has
absolutely.
to be some kind of recognition. There has to be some kind of recognition to say, you know what? You went out on a limb here. This is something new. Maybe we've never done it before in our facilities or in our environment. We need to give them a pat on the back, and not just in a closed room, right?
Public recognition.
Well, I think so, because everyone's going to benefit from this, right? Not just them.
Yeah. I think one of the fears of Kaizen participants is that they're going to own the change after it's complete. So one thing is to set their mind at ease, right? You mentioned whether or not the Kaizen is successful, right? I believe all Kaizens are successful. Maybe they don't hit their primary objective, but all Kaizens are successful in the sense of developing a team, giving individuals a new skill set, right? Walking through the troubleshooting and the brainstorming and the improvement prioritization, these are all skill sets that maybe people have on a piece by piece basis, but in the Kaizen, people learn to string these things together to get to achieve a tangible goal, a good output, a beneficial output, and that recognizing that they have been a part of this process, I think, is really important. And
I think the biggest gain is letting them feel like they have a voice, right? Which they probably didn't feel like they had one before. But if they feel like this was a really nice outlet and that people are listening, whether or not they took on every brainstorming idea that you gave, right? But that's, I think, one of the biggest gains.
Yeah, absolutely. And working with your HR department or labor resources or whatever the case may be, maybe there are some other ways that you have locally for recognizing and appreciating. A lot of companies have some programs where they can recognize employees with some sort of I'm struggling here. What do they call those? Employee recognition programs where you could give them a spiff or a spot bonus or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, because ideally your end goal is to create an environment where you can keep doing these Kaizen events. Because sure, not everyone's going to hit the target, right? But as you do more and more of them, as a culture, the company is going to shift gears, right? And they're going to find an avenue. And it's not so much about the gift receiving at the end, but most people in a company are disillusioned because they're not listened to, right? Yeah. But if you do these Kaizen events over and over again, that's your end goal, to give that problem-solving environment, that voice, right? So, absolutely.
It sounds cliche, but I've seen really beneficial outcomes when a plant manager, I've walked around plants with a plant manager the following week and gone and personally walked up and shaken hands with the Kaizen participants, and the plant manager, she'll say, "Thank you very much. I know that was an effort, and you guys did a lot, and we really appreciate it." You know what? I've seen employees beaming afterwards, said she knew my name, or he recognized my accomplishments from that week. And it does sound cliche, but that does go a long way. Letting people know that.
And not to go off the tangent, right? And we all know that a lot of individuals leave companies not because of money, right? But lack of recognition.
Like their voice is not, and their voice is not being heard. And this gives them that empowerment to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a very great discussion. This might be a big episode, just like our process mapping. So, Doug, thank you so much for coming on. And of course, you can have Doug or Marco come into your facility and help run a Kaizen event. So if you're interested, certainly feel free to reach out to us, or if you have any questions, reach out to us.
Free consultation.
We can essentially be your training wheels while you're, moving forward to your first event. We'd love to help you out. You can find us at workstreamconsulting.com or info@workstreamconsulting.com. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn at Workstream Consulting. So thank you so much again, Doug, and we will see you next time.
Thanks Liz.
Everyone.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank you, Dougie.